The counter at First Meridian Bank smelled like burnt coffee and hand sanitizer, and I remember thinking, quite calmly, that it was an odd thing to notice while my whole life was about to come apart at the seams. I had come in on a Tuesday afternoon in October to withdraw $400 for groceries and a new set of tires. A small errand, the kind of errand a woman does 1,000 times in her life without a second thought. Rosa Delgado, the teller who had known me for 6 years, who complimented my scarves and asked about my tomato plants every August, typed my account number into her terminal, and I watched her face change. Not dramatically, Rosa was too professional for drama, but her eyes narrowed by degrees, the way a person's eyes narrow when they are reading something twice to make sure they read it right the first time. Her fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. She glanced up at me, then past my shoulder toward the manager's office, then back down at the screen. "Mrs. Whitfield?" she said, so quietly that I had to lean in to hear her over the hum of the air conditioning. "You're in danger. Don't react, just listen to me." I did not react. 22 years working alongside estate attorneys teaches a woman how to keep her face still even when her stomach drops through the floor. I kept my hand resting on the counter, my checkbook open, my pen uncapped, exactly as it had been 30 seconds earlier, as though Rosa had just told me the weather. "There was an attempt yesterday," she whispered, her lips barely moving, her eyes flicking to her screen and back to me in a rhythm she'd clearly rehearsed in her head before I ever walked up to her window. To add a joint signer to this account, a man came in with a notarized power of attorney. It didn't clear our verification. I flagged it and sent it to fraud review before anyone above me saw it. But Mrs. Whitfield, I need you to know, whoever that man was, he had your late husband's account number memorized. He knew things only family would know. My mouth went dry. "Who?" I said, and even that single word came out steadier than I felt inside. "I can't say. Bank policy. But I can tell you it wasn't a stranger." She slid my receipt across the counter, folded once, the way she always did. Except this time there was a second slip of paper folded inside it, and on that slip, in small, careful handwriting, was a phone number that was not the bank's main line. "Call that after 5, she said, out loud now, in her ordinary customer service voice, the kind meant for anyone who might be listening. "Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield." I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. Because a woman my age standing at a bank counter learning her family might be trying to steal from her does not look, from the outside, like the beginning of a war. It looks like an old woman clutching a folded receipt a little too tightly. It looks like nothing at all. But I was not nothing. I had not always been the soft, agreeable widow my children believed they were dealing with. And that night, when I learned exactly why Rosa Delgado had risked her job to lean across a counter and whisper a warning into my ear, I understood that the quiet, tolerant version of myself I had been wearing for 2 years like an old coat was about to come off. If you've ever had a moment where someone you trusted completely turned out to be a stranger wearing a familiar face, I think you already know the particular cold that settles into your chest. Stay with me. This story earns that cold, and it earns what comes after it, too. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 68 years old, and for 22 years I worked as a senior paralegal at Cross & Whitfield, a small estate planning firm in Maple Ridge, Ohio, founded by my late husband's cousin and staffed, for most of my career, by exactly 4 people who cared far more about doing the work correctly than about billing hours. I drafted trusts. I organized probate files. I sat across kitchen tables from grieving families and explained, gently, what a fiduciary duty meant and why it mattered. I retired at 60, 2 years before Frank did, and for 8 years we had a good, quiet life together in the house on Birchwood Lane that we bought the year Marcus was born. Frank passed 2 years ago this past March. A heart attack, sudden, in the garden of all places, kneeling over the tomato bed we had put in every spring for 31 years. I found him there. I do not tell that part of the story often, because some things belong only to me. But I tell you now so that you understand what kind of grief I was carrying into that bank on that Tuesday, and what kind of woman my children thought they were dealing with when they looked at me and saw only a widow slowing down. I raised 2 children in that house. Marcus, my eldest, 44 now, runs a used car dealership on the edge of town called Whitfield Motors, a business he named after his father, though Frank never invested a dime in it and, privately, worried about it more than he ever let Marcus know. And Vanessa, 41, married to a man named Derek Cole, who calls himself a wealth advisor and runs a boutique investment firm out of a glass office suite 40 minutes from my house, a firm called Cole Capital Partners, whose sign, I would later learn, had not been paid for in 11 months. I loved my children, the uncomplicated way a mother loves her children, which is to say, entirely and without much analysis, right up until the week I was forced to start analyzing everything. For 2 years after Frank died, small things had begun to shift in the way Marcus and Vanessa spoke to me. Nothing you could point to and call cruel. That's the trick of it, isn't it? Cruelty rarely announces itself. It arrives first as concern. "Mom, are you sure you should be driving at night anymore?" Vanessa asked me at Easter, not quite looking at me, looking instead at Derek, who nodded along like a man agreeing with a doctor's diagnosis. "Mom, the house is an awful lot for one person," Marcus said over Sunday dinner in June, gesturing at my dining room, which was exactly the size it had always been. "Have you thought about downsizing? Something smaller, something easier?" I thought about it, in the sense that I noticed I was being asked the same question in different clothes, over and over, by 2 adult children who visited less and mentioned my age more. I noticed that Derek had started asking, with elaborate casualness, about how things were structured financially, whether Frank and I had ever set up a trust, whether my accounts were consolidated or scattered. I noticed, and I said nothing, because I did not yet have proof of anything, and because a woman does not want to believe her own children are looking at her the way a surveyor looks at land he intends to develop. There was one person in that family who never once looked at me that way. My granddaughter, Lily, Vanessa and Derek's daughter, 15 years old, all elbows and violin calluses, and a laugh exactly like her grandfather's. Lily came over on Wednesdays after school, ostensibly for a snack, actually to bake with me, because I had taught her to make Frank's mother's apple cake when she was 8, and it had become our thing. The one appointment in my week that no adult in my family had yet found a reason to cancel or reschedule. It was Lily, in fact, who called me that same Tuesday night, an hour after I'd left the bank with a folded slip of paper burning a hole in my coat pocket, her voice small and strange on the phone. "Grandma," she said, "I heard Dad on the phone with Uncle Marcus. They were talking about you. I don't think they knew I was on the stairs." "What were they saying, sweetheart?" I asked her, keeping my voice as light as I could manage, because the last thing I wanted was to frighten a 15-year-old girl with the shape of what I already suspected. "Something about a doctor and papers. Dad said, quote, 'She doesn't need to know until it's already done.' And Grandma," her voice dropped even lower, the particular hush of a child who has stumbled into an adult conspiracy and doesn't yet have the vocabulary to name it. "He said something about the house, about selling the house." I didn't understand all of it, but it scared me. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had signed Marcus's permission slips and Vanessa's college applications, and I looked at the folded slip of paper from Rosa Delgado, and I looked at my phone with my granddaughter's frightened voice still coming through it. And something inside me that had been sleeping since Frank died opened one eye. "It's all right, Lily," I told her, and I meant it, though I did not yet know if it was true. "Grandma's going to figure this out. I promise you, nothing bad is going to happen to me. But I need you to do something for me, and I need you to be very careful about it." "Anything," she said. "If you hear your father or your uncle talking about me again, I don't want you to ask them questions. I don't want them to know you're paying attention. Just remember what you can and tell me. Can you do that?" There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of a teenager deciding whether to trust an adult with something that felt too large for her. "Grandma," she said finally, "are they trying to hurt you?" I did not answer that question honestly. Not that night. That night, I told her I loved her, that she should go finish her homework, that everything would be fine. But I sat alone at my kitchen table until nearly midnight, going through the old fireproof lockbox Frank kept in the hall closet, the one with our wills and the deed and his life insurance paperwork. And that is when I found the first piece of the story that would occupy the next 4 months of my life. The lockbox had been moved. Not stolen, not emptied, just moved, from the back of the closet shelf where it had sat undisturbed since Frank's funeral, to the front, at an angle slightly different from how I always left it, the small brass key still in the lock but turned the wrong direction, as though someone had opened it, gone through it in a hurry, and closed it again without quite remembering how I kept it. Inside, everything appeared to be present. The deed to the house, Frank's will, my own updated will, drawn up 18 months ago, our marriage certificate. But tucked behind the folder holding our wills was something that had not been there before. A business card, cream-colored, embossed lettering, for a Dr. Gerald Halloway, board-certified geriatric psychiatry, with a post-it note stuck to the back in handwriting I recognized instantly, because I had watched that handwriting grow from a child's careful cursive into a man's confident scrawl across 4 decades of birthday cards. Marcus's handwriting. 3 words. Call before Thursday. I sat there in my kitchen with that card in my hand for a long time. The furnace ticked on somewhere in the basement. Outside, the wind moved through the maple tree Frank had planted the year Vanessa was born, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me a little, that whatever was coming, it had already started, and I had walked into that bank that afternoon a step behind my own children, in a race I hadn't known I was running. If you've ever stood in your own kitchen holding proof that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally had instead begun quietly building a case against you, then you understand exactly what settled into my chest that night. It wasn't fear, not entirely. Underneath the fear, something colder and steadier was waking up. 22 years of reading legal documents for a living does something permanent to a person's mind. It teaches you to see the shape of a plan hiding inside a stack of ordinary-looking paper. And what I was looking at, spread across my kitchen table at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, was the outline of a plan. I did not yet know its full shape. I did not know who Dr. Gerald Halloway was, or what Derek's business troubles had to do with any of this, or how far my own son and daughter were prepared to go. But I knew, with the flat, unromantic certainty of a woman who had spent 2 decades helping other families untangle exactly this kind of betrayal, that I was not going to find out the truth by asking my children directly. I was going to find it out the way I had been trained to. Quietly, methodically, one document at a time. I put the business card back exactly where I'd found it, closed the lockbox, and turned the key the wrong direction again, precisely as it had been, so that whoever had opened it would have no reason to suspect I'd noticed anything at all. Then I went to bed, and I lay awake until nearly 2 in the morning, listening to that house that Frank and I had built our whole life inside of. And I made myself a promise. Whatever my children thought they were about to do to me, they were about to learn something about their mother that neither of them had ever bothered to ask. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. The next morning, I called in sick to my own life, in a manner of speaking. I canceled my hair appointment, told my neighbor Doris I had a headache and wouldn't be joining her for our usual Wednesday walk, and instead I sat down with a fresh legal pad, the same yellow legal pads I had used for 2 decades at Cross and Whitfield, and I began to write down everything I knew, in order, the way I would have organized a client's case file. It helps, in moments like that, to have spent a career believing that the truth is always contained somewhere in the paperwork, if you are patient enough and organized enough to find it. I wrote down the date of Frank's death. I wrote down the approximate timeline of when Marcus and Vanessa's questions about my finances had begun, which I now placed at around 8 months after the funeral, once the initial shock and sympathy of losing their father had worn thin enough to reveal, underneath it, something more calculating. I wrote down Whitfield Motors and the fact that Marcus had leased a new Cadillac Escalade that spring, despite, as far as I knew, the dealership's sales having been flat for 2 years running. I wrote down Cole Capital Partners and the odd, specific way Derek had started talking about estate structuring at family dinners, dressing his curiosity in the language of helpfulness. And I wrote down Dr. Gerald Halloway's name and underlined it twice. I did not yet call the number Rosa had given me. I sat with it another full day, turning it over, because 22 years in estate law teaches you patience above almost every other virtue, and because I wanted to know a little more before I made any call that couldn't be unmade. But by Thursday evening, with Marcus's post-it note burning in my memory, call before Thursday, I understood I had run out of the luxury of patience. Whatever they intended to do, it was scheduled to happen on a timeline I did not control, and if I wanted to survive it with my house, my savings, and my dignity intact, I needed to move faster than my own children believed a 68-year-old widow was capable of moving. I dialed the number. It rang twice before a woman answered. "Diane Okafor?" I nearly dropped the phone. Diane and I had worked side by side at Cross and Whitfield for 15 years before she left to open her own elder law practice across town. We had exchanged Christmas cards for a decade, the kind of friendship that survives on affection and neglect in equal measure. Close enough that I trusted her instantly and had trusted her for 30 years. Distant enough that I had genuinely believed, until that Wednesday night, that we might never speak again except through a holiday card signed with a single line about the weather. "Diane," I said, "it's Eleanor Whitfield. I think I need your help, and I think I need it rather urgently." There was a pause on her end, and then, warmly, "Eleanor, my goodness, it's been what, 3 years? Tell me what's happening." I told her everything. The whisper at the bank counter, the business card in Frank's lockbox, Lily's phone call, the fragment of a conversation about doctors and papers and the house. Diane listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys learn to listen. And when I finished, there was a long silence on the line before she spoke again, and her voice had changed, had lost its warmth and gained something harder, more focused. "Eleanor," she said, "I need you to understand what I think you're describing, because I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, but I also don't want to sugarcoat it. What you're describing sounds like the early stages of an attempt to have you declared incompetent. possibly to establish a guardianship. The doctor's card, the secrecy, the timeline. It fits a pattern I have unfortunately seen before in this line of work. Someone is building a medical and legal case that you are no longer capable of managing your own affairs. And if they succeed, whoever is appointed your guardian gains control of every asset you own. The words landed in my chest like stones dropped into still water. My own children, I said, though it wasn't really a question, more a fact I was forcing myself to say aloud so it would become real. I know this is hard to hear, Diane said gently. But Eleanor, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Has anyone in your family had access to your medications recently? Has anything felt off, physically? Dizziness, confusion, memory lapses that felt unusual for you? I sat with that question for a long moment, and something cold moved through me as I remembered. I have had 2 dizzy spells in the last month, I told her slowly. Bad ones. I nearly fell in the shower 2 weeks ago. I assumed it was my blood pressure medication needing adjustment. I have an appointment with my doctor next week to discuss it. Eleanor, Diane said, and I could hear, even through the phone, that she was choosing her words with great care. I want you to bring every pill bottle you have to that appointment. Every single one. Don't take anything else from those bottles until then if you can manage without them safely. And call your doctor's office today to move the appointment up if at all possible. I am not trying to frighten you. I am trying to make sure we are not dealing with something more dangerous than paperwork. You think someone is tampering with my medication, I said, and I heard my own voice go very quiet, the way a person's voice goes quiet when they are standing at the edge of an idea too large to hold all at once. I think, Diane said carefully, that we need to find out. And Eleanor, I want you to hear this part clearly too. If what you're describing is real, this is not something you fight alone, and it is not something you fight loudly, not yet. The single most important thing you can do right now is exactly what you have already started doing. Document everything. Change nothing about your behavior that would tip anyone off. And let me help you build a case so solid that by the time anyone tries to use it against you, it becomes the very thing that destroys them instead. I sat in my kitchen that evening with the phone still warm against my ear, looking out at the maple tree in the last gray light of a Thursday in October, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I had not felt since before Frank died. Not grief, not fear exactly, though fear was certainly present. Something closer to purpose. For 2 years, I had let myself be the soft, grieving widow the world expected me to be. I had answered my children's condescending questions with patience. I had let Vanessa steer conversations about my finances without pushing back. I had let Marcus talk about downsizing as though he were doing me a kindness rather than clearing a path toward something. That was going to stop. Diane, I said, I want to do this properly. I want to do it the way we used to do it at Cross and Whitfield. Slowly. Thoroughly, so that when it's finished, there isn't a single loose thread left for anyone to pull. That, Diane said, and I could hear, for the first time that call, something that sounded almost like relief, is exactly the Eleanor Whitfield I remember. Come by my office tomorrow morning. Bring the business card. Bring your legal pad. And Eleanor, one more thing. Don't tell your children anything is wrong. Let them believe you're exactly the woman they think you are. That is going to be your greatest advantage. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my kitchen for a long while, the house settling around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. And I thought about Frank, kneeling in his tomato garden 2 years earlier, and I wondered what he would have said if he could see what our children had become in his absence. I decided in that quiet kitchen that I would rather not know the answer, because whatever grief that thought carried, I did not have room for it yet. There would be time to grieve what my children had chosen to become. First, there was work to do. I did not sleep much that night. I lay awake listening to the house, and somewhere around 3 a.m, I found myself doing something I had not done in 2 years. I got up, went to the small desk in the spare bedroom that had once been Marcus's, and I took out the old accordion folder where I kept copies of every financial document Frank and I had ever signed together. I had not touched that folder since the estate settled after Frank's death. I spread its contents across the desk under a small reading lamp, and I began, one document at a time, to remind myself of exactly what I owned, exactly how it was titled, and exactly what my children would need to do legally to take any of it from me. By the time the sun came up, I understood something that gave me the first real comfort I had felt since Rosa Delgado leaned across that counter. My children were clever enough to attempt this, but they were not clever enough, not yet, to know that the woman they were trying to outmaneuver had spent 22 years learning exactly how these plans succeeded and exactly how they failed. They had built their scheme assuming I was the same soft, unsuspecting widow I had let them believe I was for 2 years. They had no idea that woman was already gone. Diane's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian on Chestnut Street. 3 rooms with high ceilings and the particular hush of a place where people came to discuss the worst days of their lives. I arrived Friday morning at 9 sharp, the business card and my legal pad in a manila folder on the passenger seat beside me, and Diane met me at the door herself, her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair that had gone almost entirely silver since I'd last seen her. "You look tired," she said, which from Diane was a term of endearment rather than an insult, and she pulled me into a hug before ushering me back to her private office, where a pot of coffee and 2 mugs already waited on the low table between her chairs. "I didn't sleep," I admitted, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I spent half the night going back through Frank's and my old financial paperwork. I wanted to remind myself exactly what I own and exactly how it's titled before I let myself panic about what they might be trying to take." Diane smiled, the particular smile of a woman recognizing an old colleague's instincts kicking back into gear. "That's good work, Eleanor. That's exactly the work we need. Tell me what you found." I walked her through it. The house on Birchwood Lane, titled solely in my name since Frank's death, worth, by the county's last assessment, approximately $410,000, paid off in full 11 years earlier. My retirement accounts, consolidated after Frank's death into a single brokerage account holding, as of the last statement, $683,000. A certificate of deposit worth $150,000 that matured the following spring, and my will, updated 18 months ago, which left the bulk of my estate divided between Marcus, Vanessa, and a trust for Lily's education, with a modest bequest to the Maple Ridge Public Library, where I had volunteered on Saturdays for a decade. Diane wrote every figure down as I spoke, her pen moving in the same small, economical script I remembered from case files we had built together decades earlier. And I found myself, watching her work, unexpectedly comforted by the sheer familiarity of the gesture. There is a particular kind of safety in being listened to by someone who takes notes not out of politeness, but because the details genuinely matter to them. And I had not felt that kind of safety, I realized, since long before Frank died. "Tell me about the deed," Diane said, without looking up from her legal pad. "Whose name is actually on it? Not whose name you assume is on it. Whose name is written on the paper itself?" "Mine," I said, "solely. Frank and I held it jointly, with rights of survivorship for 31 years, and when he passed, the deed transferred to me alone, automatically, the way it's supposed to. I had it re-recorded with the county the following spring, once probate closed. I remember sitting in that clerk's office myself, because after 22 years of telling other people to confirm their own paperwork, I wasn't about to skip that step for my own house." Diane's mouth curved into the ghost of a smile. "Of course you didn't," she said. "That's one loose end already tied off, and it matters more than you might think. A house with a clean, solely titled deed is much harder for anyone to maneuver around than a house still tangled up in an unfinished probate matter. If Marcus or Derek were hoping to find any ambiguity there to exploit, some clever argument about the property still technically belonging to Frank's estate, some claim that they, as heirs, retained some latent interest in it, they would find nothing. You closed that door years ago, without even knowing you'd need to." I sat with that for a moment, turning my coffee cup slowly on its saucer, and I thought about how strange it was that a decision I had made purely out of habit, out of the ingrained discipline of a career spent making sure paperwork matched reality, might turn out to be the very thing standing between my family and my front door. "What about the brokerage account?" Diane asked. "Walk me through exactly how that's structured. Is it a single account or several? Is there a named beneficiary? Is there a payable on death designation?" "Single account," I said. "I consolidated everything 18 months after Frank passed, mostly because I got tired of 3 separate statements arriving every month from 3 separate institutions, each one wanting a phone call to confirm I was still alive and still capable of managing my own money. The beneficiary designation lists Marcus and Vanessa equally, 50-50, with Lily named as a contingent beneficiary should anything happen to either of them before me." "And who has access to that account currently?" Diane asked. "Online access, statement mailings, anyone with power of attorney on file with the brokerage itself. Even an old one you might have forgotten was still active." I opened my mouth to answer automatically, to say no one but myself. And then I stopped, because a small, cold thought had surfaced somewhere in the back of my mind. A thought I had not examined closely enough in the weeks since Rosa Delgado's whisper had upended my sense of my own safety. "There was an old power of attorney," I said slowly, "from years ago. Frank and I each named the other as our agent, back when we did our original estate planning, before either of us had any health concerns at all, simply as a precaution. After Frank died, I meant to update mine, to name a successor agent in case something happened to me the way it happened to him, so suddenly, with no warning. I don't believe I ever finished that update. I think the original document may still list Frank as my primary agent, deceased, with no successor named at all." Diane's pen stopped moving. She looked up at me, and something in her expression sharpened into the particular focus I remembered from the handful of cases at Cross and Whitfield that had genuinely alarmed her. Cases where the stakes had turned out to be larger, or darker, than they first appeared. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "do you know if that original document named a successor agent at all? Even a blank one? Someone who could potentially argue they were entitled to step into that role?" I closed my eyes, trying to recall the exact language of a document I had not looked at in years. A document I had drafted myself, ironically, using the same template I had used for 100 clients before Frank and I ever sat down to do our own planning. "I believe it did," I said slowly. "I believe, because it was our standard template at the time, that we named our children jointly as successor agents, in the event that either of us became unable to act as the other's agent ourselves. Marcus and Vanessa, together, as co-agents. The silence that followed that admission stretched long enough that I could hear the radiator ticking somewhere in the corner of Diane's office, and the faint sound of traffic passing on Chestnut Street below her window. That, Diane said finally, changes the shape of what we're dealing with rather significantly. If that original power of attorney is still legally active, and if it was never formally revoked when you updated your will 18 months ago, then Marcus and Vanessa may already believe, correctly or not, that they possess a legal instrument granting them authority to act on your behalf under certain circumstances. Circumstances that a compromised medical evaluation from someone like Gerald Halloway could be used to manufacture. I felt the floor of my stomach drop the particular half-inch it drops when a fact you had filed away as harmless turns out to have been, all along, quietly loaded. "I never revoked it," I said. "I never even thought about it. I updated my will. I never thought to look at the power of attorney separately because, in my mind, Frank was gone, and the document had already served whatever purpose it was going to serve." This is precisely why people in our own line of work are sometimes the last to protect themselves properly, Diane said, not unkindly, more with the particular weary affection of a woman who had watched this exact blind spot claim smarter people than either of us. We spend our careers telling clients to review every document, to leave no gap unexamined, and then we go home and let our own paperwork gather dust in a drawer because surely, nothing like this could happen to us. I laughed, a short, unhappy sound, because there was nothing else to do with the particular irony of that observation. 22 years, I said, telling grieving widows to update their power of attorney the moment their circumstances changed. And here I sit. "Here you sit," Diane agreed, having caught it 3 weeks before it could have been used against you, rather than 3 weeks after. Which, Eleanor, is precisely the difference between the clients we lost and the ones we saved. You are still entirely in the second category. But we need to revoke that old document formally, today if possible, and execute a new one naming an independent agent, someone with absolutely no financial interest in your estate, before we do anything else. "Who would you suggest?" I asked. Diane considered for a moment, tapping her pen against her lower lip. "There's a woman named Patricia Marsh," she said, "a professional fiduciary licensed by the state who handles exactly this kind of arrangement for clients in situations like yours. She has no relationship to your family whatsoever, which is precisely the point. She manages perhaps 30 similar arrangements currently, all elderly clients whose families either can't be trusted with financial authority or simply live too far away to manage it practically. I've worked with her on 4 prior cases. She is meticulous, unemotional, and entirely incorruptible, which, given what we're up against, is exactly the combination we need." I nodded slowly, feeling the shape of the plan solidifying further with every sentence, the particular satisfaction of watching a structure take form where, only weeks earlier, there had been nothing but fear and uncertainty. "Call her," I said. "Today, if she has time." Diane was already reaching for her phone. "One more thing before I do," she said, pausing with her hand on the receiver. "I want you to think back, carefully, over the past 18 months, and tell me about any other documents you may have signed, or been asked to sign, that felt at all unusual at the time. Anything Marcus or Vanessa or Derek presented to you, however small, however innocuous it seemed in the moment." I sat with that question for a long while, my mind moving backward through the quiet accumulation of ordinary family moments that now, viewed through this new and unwelcome lens, took on a different, colder shape. A form Vanessa had asked me to sign the previous spring, something about updating my emergency contact information at my doctor's office, which she had offered kindly to drop off for me since she happened to be driving past the medical building anyway. A document Derek had mentioned once, almost in passing over a Sunday dinner, something about a homestead exemption filing that he said would save me a few $100s a year on property taxes if I would simply sign where he'd marked it and let him handle the paperwork. "There was a form," I said slowly, my voice tightening as the memory sharpened into focus. "Derek brought it to dinner, maybe 10 months ago. He said it was a homestead exemption renewal, something the county required periodically. I signed it without reading it closely because Derek presented it so casually, and because I trusted him. At the time, the way you trust the man your daughter married until you have a reason not to." "Do you have a copy?" Diane asked, her voice carefully even, though I could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't remember keeping one. I assumed it was exactly what he said it was." Diane made a note, underlined it twice, and looked up at me with an expression that carried more gentleness than I think either of us expected from her in that moment. "Eleanor," she said, "I want you to understand something, and I want you to hear it without shame, because shame is not useful to you right now, and it is certainly not earned. Trusting your daughter's husband to hand you an ordinary piece of paperwork at your own dinner table is not naivete. It is simply what a functioning family is supposed to feel like. The failure here belongs entirely to the people who exploited that trust, not to the woman who extended it in good faith." I felt my eyes sting, unexpectedly, at that particular kindness, delivered so plainly across a desk in a converted Victorian on a gray October morning. "Thank you," I said quietly. "We're going to pull the county records this afternoon," Diane continued, already moving, already 3 steps ahead in the way I remembered from our years working cases side by side, "and find out exactly what that form actually authorized. If it was genuinely a homestead exemption, wonderful. We'll have wasted an afternoon confirming something harmless. But if it was something else entirely, dressed up in language designed to look harmless to a woman who had no particular reason to suspect her own son-in-law of dishonesty, then we need to know that today, not after they've already tried to use it." I nodded, and Diane picked up her phone at last, dialing Patricia Marsh's number from memory, and I sat in that quiet office listening to my old friend arrange, with brisk, unhurried competence, the first of what would become many careful countermeasures against a threat I was only beginning to fully understand the shape of. Somewhere beneath the fear, a new and unfamiliar feeling had begun to take root in my chest that morning, something I would not have called hope, not yet, but perhaps its earliest, most tentative cousin. I had walked into Diane's office believing I already understood the full scope of what my children had attempted. I was about to learn, over the following hour, that the scheme against me ran deeper and had been prepared more patiently than even the business card in Frank's lockbox had suggested. "None of it is in a trust," Diane said, more to herself than to me, tapping her pen against her legal pad. "Which means if someone successfully petitions the court to have you declared incompetent and gets themselves appointed guardian, they would gain direct control over every asset you just described. Not ownership outright, not immediately, but control, access, the ability to sell the house, the ability to liquidate the brokerage account for, quote, your care and living expenses." Guardianship abuse cases like this often look, on paper, entirely legitimate for months, sometimes years, before anyone catches on. "And Dr. Halloway," I said, sliding the business card across her desk. Diane picks it up, turned it over, read Marcus's handwriting on the back, and her jaw tightened. "I know this name," she said slowly. Not personally, but professionally. There have been whispers in the elder law community for the past 2 years about Gerald Halloway. Nothing proven, nothing that's ever resulted in a board complaint sticking, but enough smoke that several attorneys I trust have told me privately they refuse to accept any competency evaluation that comes from his office without independent corroboration. He has a reputation, Eleanor, for producing the diagnosis the paying party wants. The paying party, I repeated. Meaning, Diane said, meeting my eyes directly, whoever is footing his bill. And given that this card was tucked into your late husband's lockbox with your son's handwriting on it, I think we can make an educated guess about who that might be. I sat with that for a long moment, the coffee going cold in my hands, and I felt the particular grief of learning a suspicion you had quietly hoped would turn out to be nothing. "What do I do?" I said finally. Diane leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm, deliberate cadence I remembered from our years working cases together. The voice of a woman who had learned to stay steady precisely because the stakes in front of her were never small. "First," she said, "we get you an independent medical evaluation from a physician of your own choosing, someone with an unimpeachable reputation, so that if Halloway's report ever surfaces in a courtroom, we already have a competing, credible assessment establishing exactly how sharp you are. Second, we look at your medication. I want a full toxicology and pharmacy audit, quietly, through a pharmacist I trust, to determine whether anything in your prescriptions has been altered, substituted, or tampered with. Third, and this is the part that requires the most patience from you, Eleanor, we do not tip your hand. Not to Marcus, not to Vanessa, not even to Derek, no matter how tempting it becomes to confront them directly." "Why not confront them?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. "If I simply told them I know what they're planning, wouldn't that end it?" Diane shook her head, and there was something almost sad in her expression. The particular sadness of a woman who has seen this exact story unfold too many times to still find it surprising. "It might end this particular attempt," she said. "But Eleanor, people who are willing to try this once are willing to try it again, in a different form, once they've had time to regroup. If Halloway's evaluation gets buried today, they will find another doctor. If the wire transfer attempt at the bank gets flagged, they'll find another account, another method, another angle. The only way to end this permanently is to build a case so thorough, so well documented, that when it finally comes to light, it isn't just embarrassing for them, it's legally and publicly disqualifying. It has to end the pattern, not just this attempt." I thought about that for a long moment, and I thought too about the particular phrase Diane had used. Publicly disqualifying. There was something in that phrase that settled a plan into place in my mind, a plan I did not yet share with Diane because I had not yet fully formed it myself, but a plan nonetheless. If my children intended to stage some kind of intervention, some kind of formal confrontation designed to make me look confused and incapable in front of witnesses, then perhaps the answer was not to avoid that confrontation. Perhaps the answer was to make sure that when it happened, I controlled every single detail of how it unfolded. "Diane," I said slowly, "I think I want to let them have their intervention. Whatever they're planning, I want them to believe it's working exactly as they hoped." Diane studied me for a long moment, and something like the ghost of a smile crossed her face. "You want to let them build the trap," she said, "and then walk them into it instead." "I spent 22 years," I said, "watching families destroy each other over money and pride, always astonished every single time that they never saw the reversal coming until it had already happened to them. I think I would like to know, just once in my life, what it feels like to be on the other side of that particular astonishment." Diane laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh, and reached for her legal pad. "All right, Eleanor Whitfield," she said, "let's build you a trap." Over the following week, the machinery of my quiet defense began to assemble itself, piece by careful piece, the way I had once assembled evidence for clients navigating contested wills. Diane referred me to a physician named Dr. Patricia Nwosu, a geriatrician with an office 2 towns over and a reputation, Diane assured me, as unassailable as any in the state. I scheduled an appointment under the guise of a routine physical, nothing that would alert Marcus or Vanessa that anything unusual was underway. Dr. Nwosu spent nearly 90 minutes with me on the day of my appointment, running a full cognitive assessment alongside the standard physical examination, asking me to recall word lists, draw a clock face, count backward from 100 by sevens, name the current date and the sitting president and the county I lived in. I answered every question with the particular clarity that comes from a lifetime of precision work, and at the end of the appointment, Dr. Nwosu sat back in her chair and looked at me with an expression somewhere between professional satisfaction and personal curiosity. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "your cognitive function is entirely within normal range for your age, and frankly, sharper than most patients I see who are 20 years younger than you. Can I ask, given how thorough you wanted this assessment to be, whether there's a particular reason you're concerned about your own competency?" I considered, briefly, how much to tell her, and decided that Diane's instinct for careful truth-telling was the right one even here. "I have reason to believe someone may attempt to challenge my competency in the near future," I said simply. I wanted an independent, credible record establishing my baseline before that happens. Dr. Nwosu's expression sharpened into something more serious. "That's wise," she said, "and, unfortunately, not as rare a situation as you might hope. I'll have my full written report to you within the week, and Mrs. Whitfield, if you ever need me to testify to these findings, in any capacity, you have my word that I will." The pharmacy audit, arranged quietly through a pharmacist Diane trusted named Tom Abernathy, took longer to produce results, in part because Tom insisted on running the tests through an independent lab rather than relying solely on a visual inspection of the pills themselves. In the meantime, I did exactly as Diane instructed. I stopped taking the blood pressure medication from the bottle in my bathroom cabinet, replacing it, with Dr. Nwosu's blessing, with a fresh prescription filled directly by Tom himself and kept in a separate location Marcus and Vanessa had no access to. Within 4 days, the dizzy spells that had plagued me for the previous month stopped entirely. I remember exactly where I was standing when Tom called with the lab results 12 days later. I was in my kitchen, hands still damp from washing dishes, and Tom's voice on the phone had the particular gravity of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to deliver. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "the pills in the bottle you brought me were not lisinopril. They were a combination of your blood pressure medication cut with a sedative, diazepam, at a dosage that would explain the dizziness and confusion you described. This wasn't a pharmacy error. Someone deliberately altered the contents of that bottle after it left our shelves." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same table where I had learned, weeks earlier, about the business card in Frank's lockbox, and I found myself, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, genuinely and completely afraid. Not for my finances, not for my house, but for my own body. For the plain fact that someone in my family had been willing to alter my medication in a way that could have caused me to fall, to become genuinely disoriented, to provide exactly the kind of visible confusion a competency hearing would need to succeed. "Do you know who would have had access to the bottle?" Tom asked gently. I thought about my kitchen, about the bathroom cabinet where I kept my medications, about the key I had once given Vanessa just in case, years ago, back when giving your daughter a key to your house felt like an act of love rather than a vulnerability. I thought about the many Sunday dinners, The many afternoons when Vanessa or Marcus had wandered freely through the house I raised them in. And I understood, with a clarity that made my hands shake slightly around my coffee mug, that the answer to Tom's question was simply anyone who had ever had a key, which was, at that point, both of my children. I called Diane the moment I hung up with Tom, and I told her what the lab had found, and I heard her exhale slowly on the other end of the line, the particular exhale of a woman who has just had her worst professional suspicions confirmed. "Eleanor," she said, "I need to say this plainly, because I think it's important you hear it stated in exactly these terms. What you've just described, tampering with an elderly person's medication in order to induce symptoms that could support a false competency claim, is not merely a family betrayal. It is a crime. Multiple crimes, potentially, depending on how a prosecutor wants to charge it. Attempted fraud, elder abuse, possibly attempted poisoning, depending on the intent a prosecutor could establish. This is no longer only a matter for the family courts, Eleanor. I think it's time we brought in someone with a badge." Diane recommended a detective named Carol Jennings, who ran the Elder Financial Crimes Unit for the County Sheriff's Department, a unit Diane had worked alongside on 3 prior cases, each of them, she told me, involving families who had underestimated exactly how thoroughly the law could unravel what they had assumed was a private, unprosecutable family matter. "Tell me about her," I said, because I found, in that moment, that I needed some small handhold of information before I agreed to let a stranger with a badge into the most private wreckage of my life. "The detective. What kind of cases has she handled?" Diane was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a woman deciding how much detail would help me and how much would only frighten me further. "3 years ago," she said finally, "Carol worked a case involving a family out near Cedar Grove, a father in his 80s, a stroke survivor, whose son had convinced him to add the son's name to the deed of the family farm as, quote, a convenience, so bills could be paid more easily while the father recovered. Within 8 months, the son had taken out 2 mortgages against that farm without his father's knowledge, nearly $90,000, and was in the process of arranging to sell 40 acres of it to a developer when a neighbor noticed survey stakes going up and called the sheriff's office out of simple curiosity." "What happened?" I asked. "Carol built the case over 4 months," Diane said. "Bank records, forged signatures, a compliant notary who eventually lost her commission entirely. The son ended up with 3 years suspended, restitution, and a permanent no-contact provision the father requested himself, which I understand devastated him almost as much as the fraud had, choosing to protect himself from his own child. But the farm stayed in the family. That mattered to him more than anything else in the end. Carol has a gift, Eleanor, for understanding that these cases are never really about the money alone. She moves carefully because she knows what people actually stand to lose isn't only what's written on a bank statement." I sat with that story for a long moment, turning it over, feeling its particular weight settle against my own circumstances. A father protecting a farm rather than a son, a woman I had not yet met, apparently capable of holding both the cold mechanics of fraud and the softer, sadder human wreckage underneath it, in the same steady hands. "I keep thinking about Frank," I said quietly, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "I keep wondering what he would say, watching me sit in your office, arranging to have our own children investigated by the police. I don't know if he would understand it, or if he would think I'd become someone unrecognizable to him." Diane reached across the desk and, gently, put her hand over mine, an unusual gesture for a woman who typically kept even her warmth carefully rationed. "Eleanor," she said, I did not know Frank as well as you did, obviously, but I knew him well enough, across enough dinners and enough holiday parties over the years, to tell you something I believe with complete certainty. Frank would not recognize the version of you that stayed silent while your own children drugged you and tried to steal the house he built with you. He would recognize exactly this version, the one sitting across from me right now, gathering evidence, refusing to be erased quietly. This is the woman he married. I did not trust myself to answer that immediately, and Diane, with the particular grace of an old friend who understood precisely when silence was the kinder gift, simply let the quiet stretch between us for a moment before continuing, more briskly, back into the practical matters at hand. "I want to prepare you for something else before Carol arrives," she said. "Once law enforcement becomes formally involved, even quietly, even under a welfare inquiry rather than an open criminal case, the timeline of everything changes. We are no longer simply protecting your assets. We are potentially building toward criminal charges against your son and your son-in-law, and possibly, depending on what the investigation uncovers about her knowledge and involvement, against your daughter as well. I need you to sit with that possibility honestly, Eleanor, before Carol walks through that door, because once this machinery starts moving, it does not move gently, and it does not always move in the direction any of us might privately hope." I thought of Vanessa then, of the particular quality of her voice on the phone the day after Marcus's call, still uncertain, still capable, I told myself, of choosing differently than her husband had chosen. I thought of Lily, upstairs in her own house at that very moment, entirely unaware that the adults around her were assembling a case that could end with her father facing federal charges and her mother facing, at minimum, an investigation into how much she had known and how little she had done to stop it. "I understand," I said finally, and I meant it, though understanding a thing and being prepared to survive it are two entirely different accomplishments, a distinction 22 years in estate law had taught me better than almost any other lesson. "I want the truth, Diane, whatever shape it takes. I have spent 2 years living inside a story my children constructed for me, one piece of gentle, reasonable concern at a time, and I find I no longer have any patience left for comfortable fictions, even the ones that might spare my own feelings." Diane studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted into what I can only describe as quiet, professional respect, the particular look she used to give junior associates at Cross and Whitfield on the rare occasions they surprised her. "That," she said, "is precisely the answer I was hoping to hear. All right, let me call Carol and get her over here this afternoon, while everything is still fresh in your mind and your resolve is still exactly where it needs to be." She picked up her phone, dialed a number from memory, and spoke briefly, quietly into the receiver, arranging a meeting for 2 o'clock that same day. I sat in the chair across from her desk, looking out the tall Victorian window at the gray November sky pressing down over Chestnut Street, and I found myself doing something I had not done in the 2 years since Frank's funeral. I allowed myself, for just a few minutes, to grieve openly, silently, tears sliding down my face without any particular drama attached to them, simply the plain, honest grief of a woman who had loved her children completely and was now watching that love collide irreversibly with the truth of what they had done. By the time Diane hung up the phone, I had wiped my face dry and folded my hands back into my lap, composed again, the particular composure I had spent a lifetime perfecting for exactly these moments. 2 o'clock, Diane confirmed. She'll come here directly. And Eleanor, one more thing before she arrives. Whatever you feel in that meeting, whatever grief surfaces while you're telling this story to a stranger with a badge, let yourself feel it. Carol has seen grief before. She will not think less of you for it. The only thing that would concern her, and me, is a woman who felt nothing at all. I nodded, grateful, and spent the remaining 90 minutes before Carol Jennings's arrival helping Diane organize the growing folder of evidence into the same clean, methodical structure I had once used for client intake files. The medication results here, Dr. Nwosu's evaluation there, the business card in its own labeled sleeve. Each document a small, cold brick in a wall I had not realized until that very moment I had already begun building around myself for protection. Detective Jennings turned out to be a compact, gray-haired woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up onto her forehead and the unhurried, patient manner of someone who had spent 3 decades listening to people explain, in painstaking detail, exactly how they had been wronged. She met me at Diane's office rather than the sheriff's department, a small kindness Diane had specifically requested, understanding that whatever surveillance or suspicion Marcus and Vanessa might have around my movements, a visit to Diane's law office would raise far less alarm than a visit to a police station. "Mrs. Whitfield," Detective Jennings said, settling into the chair across from me with a small recorder placed on the table between us, its red light blinking steadily. "Diane's given me the broad strokes, but I'd like to hear the whole thing from you, start to finish in your own words. Take your time. I'm not in a hurry, and neither is this investigation. Not yet." I told her everything. Rosa's whisper across the bank counter, the failed attempt to add a joint signer using a forged or fraudulent power of attorney, Lily's frightened phone call about doctors and papers and the house, the business card tucked into Frank's lockbox with Marcus's handwriting on the back, Dr. Nwosu's assessment confirming my full cognitive competency, Tom Abernathy's lab results confirming the tampered medication. Detective Jennings listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting a note on a small pad beside the recorder, her expression giving away nothing until I finished. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said finally, "I want to commend you on how methodically you've documented all of this. Most people in your position panic, confront the family member directly, and destroy their own case before it ever has a chance to develop properly. You've done exactly the opposite. That's going to matter enormously if this ends up in front of a judge." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Detective Jennings said, "we build. I'm going to open a file, quietly, under General Elder Welfare Inquiry, rather than anything that would generate paperwork visible to the public or trigger any kind of notification to your family. I'll want copies of everything, the medication lab results, Dr. Nwosu's evaluation, the business card, and Diane tells me the bank flagged an attempted unauthorized account modification. I'll want to speak with the teller who reported it, Ms. Delgado, if she's willing. And I'll want to look at whatever surveillance footage the bank retained from that day. And Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Nothing. On the surface, at least. Let them believe their plan is proceeding exactly as they intend." I nodded, though something in my chest tightened at the thought of continuing to sit across the dinner table from my own son and daughter, smiling, asking about their weeks, pretending I did not know they had tried to drug me into confusion, to steal my home out from under me. "It's hard," I admitted, "to sit with them and say nothing." Detective Jennings's expression softened, the professional mask slipping for just a moment into something more human. "I know," she said. "I've sat with a lot of people in your position over the years, and I've never once had one tell me it was easy. But Mrs. Whitfield, I'll tell you what I tell all of them. The people who wait, who build the case properly instead of exploding the moment they learn the truth, those are the ones who win. Not just legally, they're the ones who come out the other side of this with something left standing. The ones who confront too early usually end up with a family shattered and a case too weak to prosecute. You clearly already understand that instinct. Trust it." I left Diane's office that afternoon with a strange, heavy calm settled over me. The particular calm that comes from finally having allies, finally having a plan, after weeks of carrying the entire weight of this discovery alone in my own kitchen at midnight. Driving home along the familiar curve of Birchwood Lane, past the house where I had raised 2 children who were, at that very moment, somewhere in this town, plotting to have their own mother declared incapable of managing her life, I found myself thinking not of anger, not yet, but of Frank. I thought about him kneeling in the garden the last morning of his life, and I wondered, not for the first time, what he would have made of the 2 people we raised together. And I made a decision, driving home in the gray October light, that whatever happened next, whatever cruelty my children had planned for me, I would not let it destroy the memory of who Frank and I had tried to raise them to be. I would simply make certain they understood, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what kind of woman their mother actually was. They had built their entire plan around a version of me that no longer existed, if it had ever existed at all, and they were about to meet the real one. The following 3 weeks unfolded in a strange, suspended rhythm, the ordinary surface of my life continuing exactly as it always had while, underneath it, an entirely different story assembled itself piece by piece. I attended my Wednesday baking afternoons with Lily as though nothing in the world had changed, teaching her the precise folds that kept Frank's mother's apple cake from becoming dense, listening to her talk about her upcoming violin recital and a boy named Theo in her chemistry class. And if she noticed anything different in my manner, she did not say so, though I caught her studying me once or twice with the particular watchfulness of a child who suspects the adults around her are carrying something they haven't told her. I attended Sunday dinner at Vanessa's house, where Derek poured wine and asked, with his usual elaborate casualness, whether I'd given any more thought to simplifying things financially now that you're on your own, and I smiled and said I'd think about it. The same answer I had given for 8 months, and I watched him exchange a small, satisfied glance with Vanessa across the table, a glance they clearly believed I hadn't noticed. I attended Marcus's 40th wedding anniversary party for his in-laws, standing near the punch bowl making pleasant conversation with people I barely knew, and I watched Marcus glance at his phone 3 separate times during dinner, his jaw tightening each time in a way that told me, quite plainly, that his dealership's financial troubles had followed him even to a party meant to celebrate someone else's marriage. Underneath all of it, Diane and Detective Jennings and I built our case with the patient, unhurried thoroughness of people who understood that speed was the enemy of certainty. Rosa Delgado, when Detective Jennings approached her, agreed readily to give a formal statement, along with copies of the bank's internal fraud review documentation showing the exact date, time, and method of the attempted unauthorized account modification. The bank's surveillance footage, once subpoenaed through proper channels, showed a man matching Derek's description sitting across from a different teller 2 days before my own visit, presenting documents that the bank's own records confirmed had failed authentication. Dr. Nwosu's written report arrived, 17 pages of thorough, professionally unimpeachable documentation of my complete cognitive competency. Tom Abernathy provided a sworn statement alongside the independent lab's toxicology results confirming the tampered medication. And Detective Jennings, working her own channels, discovered something that none of us had anticipated. A piece of information that reframed the entire scope of what my children were attempting. She called me on a Thursday evening in early November, her voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction I had come to recognize over our weeks of working together. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I think you should sit down for this." I was already sitting, at my kitchen table where it seemed I had spent half my autumn that year. "Go ahead," I said. "Derek Cole's investment firm is under active inquiry by the Securities and Exchange Commission," she said. "Not public yet, still in the early investigative stages, but a source I trust confirmed it for me off the record. It appears Mr. Cole has been using new client deposits to cover losses and personal debts from a series of bad investments made over the past 18 months. Standard fraud pattern, robbing new investors to pay old ones, the kind of thing that eventually collapses entirely once the money runs out. My source estimates Cole Capital Partners is short somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 that simply doesn't exist anymore. $200,000, I repeated, and something clicked into place in my mind with an audible, almost physical sensation, the particular click of a puzzle piece finally finding its proper place. That's why the timeline matters to them. That's why it has to happen before Thursday. Why Marcus wrote that note. They're not just planning ahead, Derek is running out of time. That's my read as well, Detective Jennings said. A man staring down a federal fraud investigation with a collapsing business needs money fast, and needs it in a form that doesn't immediately draw attention. Your house, your brokerage account, your CD, all of it liquid enough, once under a guardian's control, to quietly patch a hole in his books before regulators find it. Mrs. Whitfield, I think what you're facing isn't simply greed. I think you're facing a man in genuine legal desperation, which means the timeline your family is working on is likely tighter than we originally assumed, and considerably more dangerous. I sat with that information for a long moment after we hung up, turning it over in my mind, and I found myself, unexpectedly, thinking of Vanessa rather than Derek. My daughter, who had once been a shy, serious child who spent hours reading in the window seat of her bedroom, who had cried for a week when her childhood cat died, who had, at some point in her adult life, married a man whose desperation had apparently grown large enough to endanger her own mother's safety, and who had, apparently, chosen to help him rather than warn me. I did not yet know how much Vanessa knew, how much she had chosen, and how much she had simply been swept along by a husband whose charm had always been considerable and whose true nature she perhaps still did not fully see. That question, more than any other, occupied the quiet hours of my nights that November. Because whatever justice I intended to bring down on Derek, and, if it came to it, on Marcus, some small, stubborn, maternal part of me still hoped there might be a version of this story where my daughter could be saved from the wreckage rather than buried beneath it. I did not share that hope with Diane or Detective Jennings, not directly, though I suspect Diane understood it anyway, in the particular way old friends understand the things you don't say aloud. 2 weeks later, the peace we had all been waiting for finally arrived. Marcus called me on a Sunday evening, his voice carrying the practiced, gentle concern he had clearly rehearsed. The voice a man uses when he has convinced himself he is doing something kind. "Mom," he said, "Vanessa and I have been talking, and we think it would be good for the whole family to sit down together next Saturday, just to talk. About how you're doing, about the house, about the future. Nothing formal, just us talking things through, the way a family should." I closed my eyes briefly, standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear. And I thought about Diane's advice, about Detective Jennings's patient counsel, about the entire careful architecture of evidence we had spent weeks assembling. And I understood that this was the moment, the intervention Lily had overheard being planned weeks earlier, finally arriving with a date and a time attached to it. "That sounds lovely, sweetheart," I said, and I meant every word of the performance, my voice warm and slightly grateful, exactly the voice of a woman touched that her children wanted to spend a Saturday with her. "I'd like that very much." "Great," Marcus said, and I could hear, underneath his careful gentleness, A small note of relief. The relief of a man who had expected more resistance and received none. "We'll come to you, around 2. Vanessa's making that casserole you like." I hung up the phone and stood alone in my kitchen for a long moment, looking out at the bare branches of the maple tree Frank had planted the year Vanessa was born. And I felt something settle over me that was neither fear nor grief, but something closer to readiness. The particular calm of a woman who has spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment and has finally arrived at it. I called Diane immediately. "Saturday," I told her. 2:00 at my house. There was a brief pause on her end, and I could hear the sound of her flipping through papers, the particular rustle of a woman consulting a calendar she had, I suspected, kept deliberately clear for this exact call. "That's enough time," she said finally. "Eleanor, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to propose, because it's going to require more courage from you than anything else we've done so far." "I'm listening," I said. "I don't think we stop this intervention," Diane said. "I think we let it happen exactly as they've planned it, right up until the moment it's supposed to end, with you looking confused, cooperative, and ready to sign whatever they put in front of you. And then, at that exact moment, I think you show them precisely who they've actually been dealing with this entire time." I felt something steady and cold settle into place behind my ribs. The particular clarity that had first stirred in me the night I found that business card in Frank's lockbox. And I understood, standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, that whatever fear I had carried through the previous weeks had finally, fully, transformed into something else entirely. "Tell me what you need me to do," I said. Diane laid out the plan over the following 45 minutes, and by the time we hung up, I understood every piece of it. Every document I would need to have quietly prepared. Every piece of evidence Detective Jennings would need staged and ready. Every word I would and would not say until the precise moment Diane and I had agreed upon. It was, in its architecture, not unlike the countless case strategies I had helped construct across 22 years at Cross and Whitfield. Except this time, for the first time in my professional or personal life, I was not building the case for a client seated across the table from me. I was building it for myself. That week passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I baked with Lily on Wednesday, as always, and though I said nothing to her about what was coming, I found myself, at the end of our afternoon together, pulling her into a longer hug than usual, holding on to the particular warmth of a granddaughter who had never once looked at me the way her parents had begun to. "Grandma," Lily said, pulling back slightly to study my face. "You're being weird. Good weird, but weird." I laughed, genuinely, for what felt like the first time in weeks. "I promise you," I told her, "everything is going to be all right. Better than all right, actually. But Lily, I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust that I have a very good reason for asking it. Would you be willing to be at the house on Saturday afternoon, around 2? Not in the room with the grown-ups. Upstairs, maybe, with your violin. But here, in the house." Lily studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression told me that this 15-year-old girl understood, in the intuitive way that children who love someone deeply often understand things adults assume are hidden from them. That whatever was coming on Saturday mattered enormously. "Is this about what I heard Dad say?" she asked quietly. "About the doctor and the papers?" I met her eyes and decided in that moment that Lily had earned more honesty than I had been able to give her weeks earlier. "Yes," I said simply. "It's about exactly that. But Lily, I need you to know something important. Whatever happens on Saturday, it is not your fault. And it was never going to be something you could have stopped or fixed on your own. You did exactly the right thing telling me what you heard. Now it's my turn to finish what you started." Lily's eyes filled briefly, and she hugged me again, fiercely this time, the kind of hug that carries more understanding than words. "I love you, Grandma," she said. "Whatever happens Saturday, I'm on your side." "I've always been on your side." "I know, sweetheart," I told her, my own voice unsteady for the first time in weeks. "I have always known that. That's exactly why everything is going to be all right." By Friday evening, every piece Diane and Detective Jennings and I had spent weeks assembling sat ready. Copies of Dr. Nwosu's cognitive evaluation, Tom Abernathy's sworn toxicology statement, the bank's fraud documentation and surveillance footage stills, formally released to Detective Jennings through proper investigative channels. A printed transcript of the recorded phone call between Marcus and Derek that Detective Jennings had obtained, entirely legally through a wiretap warrant, issued once the medication tampering elevated the case from a family dispute into an active criminal investigation. A call in which Derek could be heard saying, with chilling casualness, "She won't even know what happened until the paperwork's already filed. Holloway just needs one bad episode on record, and we're golden." And one more document, the one Diane and I had spent the most time preparing, quietly, over the previous 10 days. A new, ironclad revocable trust, drafted by Diane herself and reviewed by a second independent attorney for good measure, transferring the house on Birchwood Lane, my brokerage accounts, and my certificate of deposit into a structure with a professional independent trustee. A structure that made any future guardianship attempt not merely difficult, but functionally meaningless, since a guardian appointed over my person would have no authority whatsoever over assets already held in an irrevocable trust managed by someone entirely outside my family. I had already signed it, quietly, the previous Tuesday, in Diane's office with 2 independent witnesses and a notary present, 3 days before Marcus had even called to schedule his Saturday intervention. Whatever my children believed they were about to accomplish that weekend, the ground they intended to seize had already, silently, been moved entirely out from under them. Saturday morning, I woke before dawn, made myself a pot of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table watching the gray November light slowly fill the yard, the bare maple tree standing sentinel over the garden where Frank had died 2 years earlier. I thought about him for a long while, sitting there alone in the quiet house, and I found myself, for the first time in weeks, not angry, not frightened, but almost peaceful. The particular peace that comes from knowing you have done every single thing within your power to protect what matters, and that whatever happens next is no longer a matter of preparation, but simply a matter of walking calmly into a room. At noon, Detective Jennings arrived at my house in an unmarked car, along with a young officer named Reyes, who carried a small, unobtrusive equipment case. Together, they installed 2 hidden cameras, one in the corner bookshelf of my living room, angled to capture the entire seating area, and one in the hallway leading to the kitchen, along with a small recording device Diane had insisted I keep in my cardigan pocket as a backup, in case anything went wrong with the primary equipment. Remember, Detective Jennings told me as she finished testing the audio levels. You don't need to do anything except be yourself. Let them talk. Let them believe they're winning. The moment comes when it comes, and Eleanor, you'll know it when it arrives. Just trust everything you've already built. At 1:45, Lily arrived early, her violin case in hand, and disappeared upstairs to her old bedroom, the one Vanessa had used as a child, now kept largely as a guest room, but still holding, in the closet, a box of Vanessa's childhood things I had never quite found the heart to give away. I heard the faint, warm sound of her tuning her violin drifting down the stairs as I set out cups and saucers on the dining table, my hands steady, my heart, remarkably, steadier still. At 2:00 precisely, I heard car doors closing in my driveway, and through the front window, I watched Marcus and Vanessa and Derek walk up my front path together. Marcus carrying a folder tucked under his arm, Vanessa carrying the casserole dish she had promised. Derek walking half a step behind them both, with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who believed the afternoon's outcome had already been decided in his favor. I smoothed my cardigan, touched the small recording device hidden in its pocket, took one steadying breath, and opened the door with a warm, welcoming smile. "Come in," I said. "It's so good to see you all." They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them inside. The casserole sat cooling on the sideboard, untouched, because none of us, I think, had come to that table actually hungry for food. Vanessa fussed over the place settings with a nervous energy that told me, even before anyone spoke, that whatever role she had agreed to play that afternoon did not sit entirely comfortably on her. Marcus sat at the head of the table, in Frank's old chair, a small detail I noticed and filed away without comment. Derek settled beside Vanessa, with his folder placed neatly in front of him, unopened, waiting. "Mom," Marcus began, once we had all taken our seats and I had poured coffee for everyone with hands that did not shake. "We wanted to talk to you today because we love you, and because we've noticed some things lately that have us a little worried." "Worried," I repeated, keeping my voice light, curious, exactly the tone of a mother genuinely puzzled by her children's concern. "You've seemed a bit forgetful," Vanessa said gently, not quite meeting my eyes, her fingers turning her coffee cup in small, anxious circles. "Missing appointments, confused about dates. And Mom, we heard from someone at the bank that there was some kind of mix-up on your account recently. We just want to make sure you're safe." I noted, with the cold, precise part of my mind that had been cataloging every detail of this conversation since the moment they walked through my door, that Vanessa had inverted the story entirely, transforming their own failed, fraudulent attempt into evidence of my supposed confusion. It was, I thought, almost impressive in its shamelessness, if it hadn't been so devastating in its cruelty. "I haven't noticed any confusion," I said carefully, letting a small note of worry creep into my voice. Exactly the worry a woman might feel upon being told, gently, by people she trusted, that something might be wrong with her own mind. Should I be concerned? Derek leaned forward then, opening his folder with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had rehearsed this exact gesture in front of a mirror. "Eleanor," he said, and something in the way he said my name, warm, patronizing, faintly performative, made the hair on my arms stand up. We've actually taken the liberty of scheduling an evaluation for you. Just a precaution. A wonderful doctor, very gentle, very thorough. Dr. Holloway. He specializes in exactly these kinds of concerns for people your age. People my age, I repeated, and I let just the faintest edge of hurt color my voice. The wounded tone of a woman who has just realized her family sees her as a category rather than a person. Is that what I've become? Mom, don't be dramatic, Marcus said. And there it was, the first thread of impatience slipping through his careful, gentle performance, the tell I had been waiting for. We're trying to help you. You have to understand, at your age, with everything you're managing alone since Dad passed, it's a lot for anyone. And frankly, Mom, we all know you're not as sharp as you used to be. Sweet, forgetful Mom. I had heard variations of that phrase for 2 years, delivered in tones of loving concern that had, I now understood with total clarity, always been calculated. Always been a slow, patient campaign to establish, in front of any future audience, a narrative of my decline that had never actually existed anywhere except in the story they needed to tell. I see, I said quietly, folding my hands on the table in front of me, the very picture of a wounded, compliant elderly woman absorbing painful news from the children she trusted most in the world. What exactly is in the folder, Derek? Derek slid the papers across the table toward me with a gentleness that made my skin crawl, given everything I now knew about what those documents actually represented. Just some paperwork, he said soothingly. A power of attorney, giving Vanessa and Marcus the ability to help manage things for you. Just temporarily, just until Dr. Holloway's evaluation confirms everything is fine. It's really just a formality, Eleanor, a safety net, nothing to worry about. I looked down at the document, a durable power of attorney granting Marcus and Vanessa broad authority over my financial affairs. Drafted, I noted, by a law firm I did not recognize. Its language deliberately broad, deliberately permanent despite Derek's soothing insistence that it was temporary. I let my hand hover over the pen Vanessa had thoughtfully, helpfully already placed beside it. This was the moment. I felt it arrive the way you feel a change in weather pressure before a storm actually breaks, that particular stillness in the air that precedes something enormous. Before I sign anything, I said slowly, my voice still soft, still wounded, still every inch the confused, compliant mother they had spent 2 years constructing in their own minds. I think I'd like to ask you all something. Just a small question. Does anyone remember what you used to call me, Marcus, when you were trying to convince Vanessa I needed, quote, protecting from myself? Marcus blinked, thrown briefly off balance by the strange specificity of the question. I don't know what you mean, Mom. Sweet, forgetful Mom, I said, and I let my voice change then, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a precision and steadiness that had nothing whatsoever to do with confusion. That's the phrase, isn't it? I've heard it. Not from you directly, of course, you're far too careful for that. But I've heard it. The temperature in the room shifted instantly, palpably, the way a kitchen changes when someone opens a door to freezing air. Vanessa's hand stilled on her coffee cup. Derek's easy, practiced smile faltered by the smallest degree. Mom, Marcus said carefully, I think you might be confused. No, I said, and I reached into my cardigan pocket and withdrew the small folder Diane had prepared, setting it on the table beside the untouched power of attorney with a soft, deliberate click. I think, Marcus, that for the first time in 2 years I am entirely, completely unconfused. I opened the folder and began, one document at a time, exactly as Diane and I had planned, to lay their entire scheme out on my own dining table for all 3 of them to see. I started with Dr. Nwosu's cognitive evaluation, sliding it across the table so it landed directly in front of Derek. This is a full neurological and cognitive assessment, I said, my voice even, unhurried, the voice I had once used to explain complicated trust documents to grieving widows across this very table. Conducted 3 weeks ago by a board-certified geriatrician with an unimpeachable professional reputation, it confirms, in 17 pages of detail, that my cognitive function is entirely normal, sharper, in fact, than the doctor's own words, than most patients 20 years my junior. Derek's face had gone very still. Vanessa's eyes darted between the document and her husband's face, searching for reassurance she was clearly no longer finding. I obtained this evaluation, I continued, the same week I discovered a business card for Dr. Gerald Halloway tucked into your father's fireproof lockbox, Marcus, with a note in your handwriting on the back that said, and I remember it precisely, call before Thursday. Mom, I can explain, Marcus started, but I raised one hand, gently, the small gesture I had once used in mediation meetings to signal that the floor was not yet open for rebuttal, and to my genuine surprise, he stopped talking. I'm sure you can, I said, but let me finish showing you what I found first, and then you can explain everything, all at once, to everyone who needs to hear it. I slid the next document across the table, Tom Abernathy's sworn statement alongside the Independent Lab's toxicology report. This is a laboratory analysis of the blood pressure medication I have been taking for the past several months, I said. It confirms that the pills in my prescription bottle were not, in fact, lisinopril alone, but a combination of my medication and a sedative, diazepam, in a dosage sufficient to cause the exact dizziness and disorientation I experienced repeatedly over the past 2 months. Someone with access to my house altered my prescription. Someone wanted me confused, disoriented, unsteady. Exactly the kind of episode a doctor like Halloway would need documented on record to support a favorable competency finding. The color had drained entirely from Vanessa's face. Mom, she whispered, I didn't. I never touched your medication. I swear to you, I believe you, I said, and I meant it. And something in my voice must have carried the weight of that belief, because Vanessa's composure cracked visibly. Her eyes filling with tears, she seemed unable to stop. I believe you didn't touch it yourself, Vanessa, but I don't think you asked very many questions about who did you? Derek's jaw had tightened into a hard, flat line, and I watched him glance, briefly, toward the front door. The particular glance of a cornered man calculating an exit that did not, in fact, exist for him anymore. This is absurd, he said, his voice climbing slightly, the smooth, performative warmth entirely gone now, replaced by something sharper, more defensive. Eleanor, sweetheart, you understand less than you think you do. There it was, the exact phrase, word for word, that Detective Jennings's wiretap had captured him saying to Marcus 3 weeks earlier. Discussing me. Discussing this very afternoon. Discussing exactly how they intended to make me believe I was losing my grip on reality. I felt something settle into perfect, icy stillness in my chest, and I understood, in that moment, that Diane had been entirely right about how this confrontation needed to end. Funny you should say that, I said quietly, because I have you saying almost exactly that same sentence, word for word, on a recorded phone call with Marcus 3 weeks ago, along with several other things you said, Derek, that I think everyone at this table deserves to hear. I reached into my cardigan pocket and set a small recording device on the table, pressing play with a steadiness that surprised even me. Marcus's voice filled the dining room first, tinny but perfectly clear, followed immediately by Derek's, exactly as Detective Jennings's transcript had documented it. She won't even know what happened until the paperwork's already filed. Holloway just needs one bad episode on record, and we're golden. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your eardrums. And I watched, with something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but some complicated third thing sitting between the two, as Derek's face went the color of old ash, and Marcus stared down at his own hands as though he no longer recognized them. "That recording," I said into the silence, "along with everything else I've shown you today, is already in the possession of Detective Carol Jennings of the County Sheriff's Elder Financial Crimes Unit. Along with bank surveillance footage, Derek, of you attempting to add yourself as a joint signer on my checking account, using a power of attorney the bank's own verification process rejected as fraudulent. Along with documentation that Cole Capital Partners is currently under active investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for misappropriating client funds. A shortfall, I understand, currently sits somewhere around $200,000. How do you... Derek started, his voice cracking on the question, and I felt, for the first time all afternoon, something that might have been the smallest flicker of pity, quickly extinguished by the memory of 2 months of dizzy spells and a granddaughter's frightened voice on the phone. "I used to spend 22 years of my career," I said, my voice never rising, never wavering, "helping families protect exactly what you were trying to steal from me. I know precisely how these schemes are built, Derek, because I spent a career watching them fail. And I know precisely how they're dismantled, because I spent that same career doing the dismantling." I looked at Marcus then, my son, sitting in his father's chair with his father's dining room table spread with the evidence of exactly what he had allowed himself to become. And I felt the particular grief that has no good name, the grief of loving someone completely while also, finally, seeing them clearly. "You called me forgetful," I said quietly. "Sweet and forgetful. I want you to understand something, Marcus. I remember everything. Every single Sunday dinner where you and your sister asked me carefully constructed questions about my finances while your father's grave was barely settled. I remember every casual comment about downsizing, every gentle suggestion that I might be slowing down. I remember all of it, and I have documented all of it. And I am not the woman you built your entire plan around." Marcus finally looked up, his face a wreck of shame, and something that might have been the first honest fear he had felt in this entire scheme. Fear not of Detective Jennings or of prosecution, but of the plain, unbearable fact of his mother's face across the table, seeing him fully, without illusion, for the very first time in years. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "I never wanted to hurt you. Derek said, he told me the dealership would fold without help. He said this was the only way to protect the family, to keep everything, the house, everything, in the family. That you'd understand eventually, that I would understand you drugging me," I said, and for the first time that afternoon, my voice did rise. Not into a shout, I had promised myself I would not shout, but into something hard and clear and absolutely unmistakable. Into confusion, so a doctor you paid could declare me incompetent, so you could seize control of everything your father and I built together over 40 years of marriage. To bail out a business you mismanaged and an investment firm your brother-in-law was using to defraud his own clients. Is that the understanding you were hoping for, Marcus? The room had gone utterly silent, except for the faint, distant sound of Lily's violin drifting down from upstairs, a slow, sweet melody she had clearly chosen deliberately, and I found myself, in the middle of the worst confrontation of my adult life, deeply grateful for the reminder that somewhere in this house, something good and untouched by any of this ugliness still existed. "There's more," I said quietly, and I watched all three of them brace themselves, Vanessa's hands trembling around a coffee cup she could no longer bring herself to drink from, Marcus staring at the tabletop, Derek's eyes darting toward the front door one final time. "Because I want you to understand something. This confrontation, right now at this table, was never actually the moment that mattered most. That moment happened 3 weeks ago, quietly, in an attorney's office, with 2 independent witnesses and a notary present." I reached back into the folder and withdrew the final document, the one Diane and I had prepared with such careful, deliberate patience, and I set it down in the center of the table, watching 3 sets of eyes fall upon it at once. "Everything I own," I said, "the house on Birchwood Lane, my brokerage accounts, my certificate of deposit, all of it, has already been transferred into an irrevocable trust managed by an independent professional trustee. It happened 3 days before you called to schedule this little intervention, Marcus. Whatever guardianship you were hoping to establish over me today would have accomplished exactly nothing, because there has been nothing left within your reach to control for the past 3 weeks. You built your entire plan, gambled your entire future on assets that had already, quietly, moved somewhere you could never touch them." The silence that followed was, I think, the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my life. Derek's face had drained to a color I have only ever seen on the very ill or the very frightened. Vanessa had begun, quietly, to cry, her shoulders shaking with the particular grief of a woman finally understanding the full shape of what she had allowed herself to become part of. And Marcus simply stared at the trust document in front of him, his father's chair suddenly, visibly, too large for the man sitting in it. "You knew," Marcus said finally, his voice hollow. "This whole time, you knew." "I have known," I said. "Since a bank teller I have known for 6 years leaned across her counter and whispered a warning to me because she couldn't bear to watch what was about to happen to a customer she respected. I have known since I found a business card in your father's lockbox with your handwriting on it. I have known for weeks, Marcus, and every single day of those weeks, I sat across dinner tables from both of you, and I smiled, and I asked about your weeks, and I let you believe you were still dealing with the same woman you'd convinced yourselves I had become. I stood then, slowly, deliberately, the same steady motion I had once used at the end of countless mediation meetings when it was time for a difficult conversation to reach its close. Detective Jennings has copies of everything I've shown you today, I said. The recorded phone call, the medication tampering, the fraudulent bank documents, the financial motive behind all of it. I believe she'll be in touch with you very soon, Derek, given the ongoing SEC matter, and I suspect quite soon after that with you as well, Marcus. What happens in those conversations is now entirely between you and the law. It is no longer something I control, and frankly, it is no longer something I have any interest in controlling. I walked to my front door and opened it, holding it steady, the cold November air pouring into the house, and I looked at my son and my daughter, and the man my daughter had married, and I said the only thing left to say. I think it's time for you to go. They had no idea, walking up my front path an hour earlier, that they were walking into the last afternoon their careful, cruel little plan would ever get to exist as anything other than evidence. Derek left first, without a word, his face the color of ash, moving through my front door and down the porch steps with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man whose entire world had just collapsed beneath him in real time. I watched him fumble with his car keys twice before he managed to unlock the door, and I felt, watching him go, remarkably little. Not triumph, not quite. More the flat, quiet satisfaction of watching a structure finally fall that you had spent weeks carefully, patiently undermining. Marcus lingered a moment longer, standing in my front hallway with the trust document still clutched in one hand, staring at it as though it might, if he looked at it hard enough, rearrange itself into something less devastating. "Mom," he said quietly, I don't know how to fix this." "I don't know either, Marcus," I said honestly. "I think that's something you're going to have to sit with for a while. I love you. I want you to know that, because I don't think that particular fact has ever actually been in question, not for one single day of your life. But loving you and trusting you are two entirely different things, and you spent the last several months making very sure I understood the difference." He nodded, his eyes wet, and turned to leave, and I closed the door behind him, softly, and stood in my own front hallway for a long moment, listening to the sound of 3 car engines starting in my driveway and pulling away down Birchwood Lane, until the house was quiet again, except for the faint, sweet sound of Lily's violin still drifting down from upstairs. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs suddenly entirely exhausted in the particular way that follows an enormous release of tension. And I found Lily sitting on the edge of her mother's old childhood bed, violin lowered but still in her hands, her face turned toward the door, waiting. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "The worst part is," I told her, sitting down beside her on the bed, and she leaned her head against my shoulder the way she had done since she was small enough to fit entirely into my lap. "There will be more to come. Lawyers, and probably a courtroom, and things that won't be pleasant for any of us. But the worst part, the part where I didn't know what was happening to me, that part is over." Lily was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, in the small, careful voice of a child working up the courage to ask something enormous, "Is my dad going to go to jail?" I did not lie to her. I had promised myself, weeks earlier, that whatever else this ordeal cost my family, I would not add dishonesty to Lily's burden. "I think it's very likely," I said gently. "What he did was not just unkind, Lily. It was against the law. And the law tends to take these things seriously, especially when money and someone's safety are both involved." She cried then, quietly, and I held her, and I thought, not for the first time that autumn, that the cruelest cost of what Marcus and Vanessa and Derek had attempted was not anything that had happened to me. It was this 15-year-old girl sitting in her mother's childhood bedroom, learning far too young that the adults she loved most were capable of choices this devastating. We stayed upstairs together for nearly an hour, until Lily's tears had run their course and her breathing had steadied. And then I drove her home myself, staying only long enough to make sure Vanessa was there, sitting alone at her kitchen table in the growing dark, her face still blotchy from crying, staring at nothing in particular. "I'll call you tomorrow," I told her, standing in her doorway, and Vanessa looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a small girl caught in some minor, forgivable childhood lie, an expression of pure, unguarded shame. "Mom," she said, "I am so sorry. I didn't think it would go this far. I told Derek it felt wrong. I told him, but he kept saying it was the only way, and I didn't stop him. And I should have. I know I should have." "I know," I said, and I meant it, though I did not yet know what forgiveness, if any, I would eventually be able to offer her. "We'll talk tomorrow, Vanessa. Take care of Lily tonight. She needs you more than she's ever needed you, and she needs you steady." I drove home through the cold, dark November evening, the streets of Maple Ridge quiet and unremarkable around me, and I found myself thinking, as I pulled into my own driveway and looked up at the dark windows of the house Frank and I had built our life inside of, that I had expected somehow to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something far more complicated. Grief layered over relief, layered over a strange, hollow ache for the family I had once believed I had. A family that had apparently stopped existing in any real sense long before I ever learned the truth about it. But underneath all of that complicated grief, something steadier had also taken root. I had protected myself. I had protected my home, my savings, my independence, the entire architecture of the life Frank and I had spent 40 years building. And I had done it not through anger, not through cruelty, but through the same patient, methodical competence I had spent an entire career cultivating, the competence my own children had somehow managed to forget I possessed. They had underestimated me for 2 solid years, and in the end, that underestimation had been the single greatest gift they gave me, because it meant that when the moment finally came, I held every advantage, and they held nothing at all. The weeks that followed moved with the particular strange velocity of a story finally allowed to conclude after months of careful, quiet build-up. Detective Jennings, armed with everything I had presented that Saturday afternoon, along with weeks of independently gathered evidence, moved quickly once the case was no longer a matter of private family suspicion, but of documented, prosecutable crime. Derek Cole was arrested 11 days later, on a Tuesday morning, at the glass office suite that housed Cole Capital Partners, charged initially with attempted fraud and elder financial abuse at the state level, charges that expanded considerably 3 weeks after that, when the Securities and Exchange Commission's investigation concluded and federal prosecutors added charges of securities fraud and wire fraud related to his misappropriation of client funds. The shortfall at his firm, once fully accounted for, came to $234,000, money belonging to 11 different clients, most of them retirees not unlike myself, who had trusted Derek with their own savings and received, in return, a carefully constructed fiction. I learned through Detective Jennings that Derek's attempt to gain control of my assets had been, in his own words during police questioning, a last, desperate effort to cover the shortfall before an internal audit at his firm discovered it. He had believed, apparently, that once appointed my guardian, he could quietly liquidate enough of my accounts to replace the missing client funds before anyone noticed, banking on my continued goodwill and my children's continued silence to keep the entire scheme buried indefinitely. Marcus was charged separately for his role in facilitating the fraudulent power of attorney and for what the prosecutor's office determined was his knowing participation in arranging Dr. Holloway's compromised evaluation, though his charges, given his more limited direct involvement in the medication tampering, which the investigation eventually traced conclusively to Derek alone, carried lighter potential penalties. Marcus's attorney negotiated a plea agreement over the following months, one that would ultimately spare him prison time in exchange for probation, mandatory financial counseling, and full cooperation in the ongoing case against Derek and Dr. Holloway both. Dr. Gerald Holloway, it emerged during the investigation, had produced no fewer than 6 competency evaluations over the previous 4 years that an internal state medical board review later determined showed a disturbing pattern of conclusions matching whoever was paying his invoice rather than any objective clinical assessment. His medical license was suspended pending a full board hearing, and Detective Jennings told me, with grim satisfaction, that at least 2 other families from earlier cases had come forward once news of the investigation became public, describing strikingly similar attempts to have elderly relatives declared incompetent using Holloway's compromised evaluations as the medical foundation. Whitfield Motors, Marcus's dealership, closed its doors permanently the following spring, unable to survive both its existing debts and the reputational damage of its owner's arrest, however limited that arrest's coverage had been in our small town's local paper. I felt, learning this, an ache I had not expected, not for Marcus's cruelty, which I had fully reckoned with, but for the dealership itself, which had once been, in its earliest years, a genuinely hopeful venture, a young man's earnest attempt to build something of his own, before greed and desperation had curdled it into something else entirely. Vanessa's path through the aftermath proved more complicated and more painful than either Derek's or Marcus's. She was never charged criminally, Detective Jennings having concluded, based on the evidence, that Vanessa's involvement, while morally indefensible, had not risen to the level of active criminal participation, particularly given the recorded phone call establishing that the medication tampering and the fraudulent bank documents had been arranged and executed by Derek and Marcus without her direct knowledge of the specific mechanisms, even if she had known, in general terms, that some plan against me was underway and had chosen not to warn me. That distinction, the difference between active participation and passive, cowardly complicity, occupied a great deal of my thinking during the months that followed, particularly on the many nights I lay awake turning over the question of what, if anything, I owed my daughter going forward. Vanessa came to see me alone, 3 weeks after that Saturday afternoon, sitting across my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never drank. And she told me, in halting, tearful fragments, the fuller story of how she had arrived at complicity. Derek's business troubles, she said, had begun nearly 2 years earlier, far longer than any of us had realized, and he had kept the true severity hidden from her for most of that time, revealing the full scope only gradually, in pieces, each revelation accompanied by increasingly desperate reassurances that he had a plan, that everything would be fine, that she simply needed to trust him. By the time I understood how bad it really was, she told me, her voice small, he'd already convinced Marcus to go along with the doctor, with the paperwork. I told him it felt wrong. I told him I didn't want any part of it. But Mom, I didn't leave. I didn't call you. I told myself I was protecting Lily, protecting our marriage, protecting the life we'd built. And the whole time, I was protecting exactly nothing, because none of it was real to begin with. I sat with my daughter's confession for a long time before I spoke, weighing, as carefully as I had weighed every document in this entire ordeal, exactly what response I owed her. Vanessa, I said finally, I am not going to pretend that what you did, or failed to do, didn't hurt me. It did. It hurt me terribly. There were nights I lay awake wondering whether the daughter I raised had simply disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. Vanessa's face crumpled, but I continued, gently, because there was more to say. But I also watched you cry at my table the night this all came apart, and I believe those tears were real. And more than anything else, Vanessa, I watched you raise a daughter who, at 15 years old, had more moral clarity than either you or her father managed to find in this entire affair. Lily came to me the moment she suspected something was wrong. She chose honesty over comfort, at 15, in a way that neither of her parents managed at 40. That tells me something about you, too, whether you can see it in yourself right now or not. We did not resolve, that afternoon, the full shape of what our relationship would become. Some wounds, I have learned across 68 years of living, do not heal on any schedule convenient to the people who caused them. But I told Vanessa I was willing to try, slowly, carefully, to rebuild something between us, provided she was willing to do the difficult, unglamorous work of actually earning that trust back, rather than simply expecting it returned to her out of habit or blood. She left Derek 4 months later, filing for divorce shortly after his federal sentencing hearing concluded with a term of 6 years, a sentence that felt to me neither vindictive nor insufficient, simply proportionate to the harm he had caused, both to me and to the 11 clients whose retirement savings he had gambled away. Vanessa moved with Lily into a small rental house on the other side of Maple Ridge, took a job as a bookkeeper at a local accounting firm, work she told me she found unexpectedly steadying, and began, slowly, the long work of becoming someone her daughter could fully trust again. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than the satisfying, tidy version of this story might suggest. My relationship with Vanessa today, more than a year after that Saturday afternoon, remains careful. We speak often. We have dinner together most Sundays, a tradition we rebuilt slowly, deliberately, the way you rebuild anything that has been badly damaged. But I do not fully trust her the way I once did, without thought, without hesitation, and I suspect I never fully will again. Some part of that particular trust, once broken by a parent's discovery that their own child chose silence over protection, simply does not grow back in exactly its original shape. What grows in its place is something more careful, more conditional, and strangely, in some ways more honest than what came before it. Marcus, I see far less. He completed his probation, moved to a different state to start over, and writes to me occasionally. Brief, careful letters that read like the letters of a man still working out how to apologize for something that cannot fully be apologized for. I have not yet decided what, if any, relationship we will rebuild. I have decided only that the door is not entirely closed, because he is still my son, and I have not yet found it within myself to close that door permanently, however much of that particular reluctance is grief rather than forgiveness. Rosa Delgado, the teller whose whispered warning began this entire story, received a formal commendation from First Meridian Bank's regional office once the full scope of the case became clear. And I have made a point, every month since, of stopping by her window specifically, even when my banking needs could easily be handled at any other counter, simply to say hello, to ask about her own family, to let her know, in whatever small way I can, that her courage that Tuesday afternoon changed the entire trajectory of my life. "You didn't have to risk your job for me," I told her once, standing at her counter on an ordinary Tuesday nearly a year later, and Rosa had smiled, the particular smile of someone who has done something quietly brave and doesn't entirely know how to accept gratitude for it. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I've watched a lot of people come through this branch over the years. I know what it looks like when someone's family is circling something they shouldn't be circling. I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd said nothing and something terrible happened to you afterward. You deserved to know." I think about that phrase often, "you deserved to know," because I believe it captures something essential about what got me through this entire ordeal. I did deserve to know. Every person deserves to know when the people closest to them have begun, quietly, to see them as an obstacle rather than a mother, a burden rather than a person. And once I knew, everything else, the careful documentation, the quiet alliances, the patient trap laid and finally sprung, all of it flowed naturally from that single foundational truth. Lily and I still bake together every Wednesday. She is 16 now, taller than she was that autumn, more confident in the particular way of a girl who has watched her own moral courage matter in a real, consequential way, who understands, at an age when most children are still protected from such lessons, exactly how much it can cost to tell the truth, and exactly how much more it costs in the long run to stay silent instead. Last month, she made Frank's mother's apple cake entirely on her own, from memory, without needing me to guide her through a single step. And when she pulled it from the oven, golden and perfect, she looked at me with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated pride that I found myself, quite unexpectedly, crying at my own kitchen table, the same table where this entire story had once threatened to end with me signing away everything Frank and I had built together. "Grandma," she said, alarmed, setting down the pan, "why are you crying? Is it bad? Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," I told her, wiping my eyes and laughing at the same time, the particular laugh that arrives when grief and joy occupy exactly the same moment. "You did everything exactly right. You have been doing everything exactly right since the very beginning of all of this. I am simply, finally, allowed to be happy about it. If you have made it this far with me, I suspect you already understand something about your own life that this story only helped illuminate rather than invented. Perhaps you have felt it yourself, that particular, quiet dread of being underestimated by the very people who ought to know you best. Perhaps you have watched, with a sinking heart, as concern in your own family curdled slowly into something calculating, something that measured your worth in terms of assets rather than affection. I want to tell you what I learned, because I think it applies far beyond the specific, extraordinary circumstances of my own story. The people who count on your silence are always, without exception, counting on the version of you they have decided to see, not the version of you that actually exists. My children built an entire scheme around a woman who no longer existed by the time they tried to execute it, if she had ever fully existed at all. They mistook my patience for weakness. They mistook my grief for confusion. They mistook, above everything else, my quiet for surrender. It was never surrender. It was simply a woman gathering herself, the way a person gathers themselves before doing something difficult and necessary. And I want you to understand that if you are gathering yourself right now, for whatever difficult and necessary thing your own life is asking of you, that gathering is not weakness either. It is the work that comes before every real act of courage, whether anyone watching understands that or not. I lost, in the course of this story, the easy, uncomplicated version of my family I had believed I still possessed. I gained, in its place, a clearer understanding of exactly who loved me and exactly who had simply been waiting, patiently, for an opportunity. I do not regret the trade, though I grieve it still, on quiet evenings, when the house feels large and the memory of Frank and his tomato garden feels close enough to touch. What I would tell you if you were sitting across this kitchen table from me the way so many families once sat across from me during my years at Cross and Whitfield is simply this. Trust your instincts when something in your own family begins to feel less like love and more like management. Document what you can. Build alliances quietly with people who have proven, through action rather than mere words, that they belong on your side. And when the moment finally comes to show the people who underestimated you exactly who they have actually been dealing with, do it calmly, do it thoroughly, and do it with more grace than they ever extended to you. Because that grace, more than any courtroom victory, is what will let you sleep peacefully once it is finally over. I sleep peacefully now, most nights, in the house Frank and I built our whole life inside of, a house that remains, to this day, entirely and irrevocably mine, protected by a trust my own children never saw coming, discovered only because a bank teller named Rosa Delgado cared enough about a customer to risk her own job with a single whispered warning. "You're in danger," she told me, that ordinary Tuesday afternoon. And she was right. More right than either of us understood in that first moment. But danger, I have learned, is not always the end of a story. Sometimes, if you are patient and careful and willing to become, once again, the fullest and sharpest version of yourself, danger is simply the place where a much better story finally begins. Have you ever had a moment where someone you loved showed you, all at once, exactly who they really were? I would love to hear your story in the comments below, whatever shape it took in your own life. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength or your own family's complicated truths, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe for more stories like Eleanor's. There is always more strength in you than the people who underestimate you will ever bother to imagine. And I hope, wherever you are watching this from tonight, you remember that the next time someone tries to convince you otherwise,